I love the church that I serve today, Central Presbyterian Church in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. I am in awe of its faithfulness in days past. In August 1968, Central hosted thousands of mourners to Atlanta when Dr. King was murdered. Early in the 20th century, church leader John Egan was instrumental in establishing the first well baby clinic in Atlanta at Central. Also at the turn of the 20th century, Central church officers supported the strikers at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. I love this church, and so have my predecessors in the pulpit, such distinguished preachers as Stuart Oglesby, Randy Taylor, Buddy Ennis, Joanna Adams, Ted Wardlaw, Kim Clayton, Agnes Norfleet, and such noted guest preachers as Martin Niemöller, the Lutheran pastor from Berlin who in 1965 stood in the Central pulpit and spoke these words now found on the Holocaust Museum in Boston. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up. The Central Presbyterian congregation stands on the shoulders of saints who worshiped and advocated, learned and prayed, who listened and spoke out, who gave sacrificially. I love this church. I love walking around during the week to see the church abuzz with life. I love being greeted by the guys who are coming out of the Central night shelter after a good night's sleep and are lining up for services at the Central Outreach Center. I love encountering faithful members at the hospital who've already been there long before I arrive. I love this church. I'm proud to be Central's pastor, and yet despite all the good and wonderful and inspiring things about Central, I serve a congregation that suffers from a serious evangelism allergy. Even mention the word evangelism and some start to twitch and others break out in a rash. My message from the Gospel of Mark to my dear friends is be healed. Stop saying we do social justice at Central, they do evangelism. I want it to be known publicly that I am an evangelical, social justice Christian, as are all who are washed in the waters of baptism and who are fed at the Lord's table. An evangelical, social justice Christian is someone who begins and ends each day by celebrating, announcing, praying, and living the good news, the evangelion, that we see embodied in Jesus. Evangelical social justice Christians are no spectators waiting to watch the Super Bowl of religion play out on some distant field. No, they are on the field, on their knees, followers of the demon-dashing, law-transcending, boundary-breaking, tradition-challenging Son of God, whom we come to meet in the Jesus of the Gospel of Mark. I've spent much of my adult life studying and writing and preaching on the Gospel of Mark. The Jesus we meet in Mark is not looking for people who are impressed by him, who think he is a good teacher, or who are inspired by him as a man of virtue. The Jesus we meet in Mark is a Jesus who expects people to leave everything behind to follow him. That Jesus is not necessarily the Jesus that we have often met in the church. Mark's Jesus won't stay put in any sanctuary. Mark's Jesus does not worry about the company he keeps. And brick by brick, he tears down the dividing walls of race and sexuality and money and title that the world and often the church work so hard to keep in place. Mark's Jesus is not much interested in how prosperous, how esteemed, how powerful we are. He cares if we are willing to follow him, even into places where prosperity, esteem, and power rarely visit and never stay. And if we are willing to work with him to keep tearing down all the walls that divide us. That's what an evangelical, social justice Christian looks like. It looks like Mark's Jesus. Recently, I was involved in a conversation that happens frequently at Central. The conversation about what was the church going to do with those people. A euphemism for the homeless who sleep outside our building and often use our building and shrubbery as a restroom. Around the table, some shared their fears, and I shared my indignation about how easily we stereotype and ostracize the stranger. Finally, my colleague said, wait a minute. And she raced outside and she invited some of those people to sit at table with us, to join in the conversation. And I swear, Jesus found his way in through our locked doors and joined us at that table. The conversation shifted, and suddenly a wall of misunderstanding collapsed and new possibilities were born. In that moment, my colleague was an evangelical social justice Christian in the finest form. I keep getting surprised at how often Jesus shows up when I stop talking and start listening, when I stop fearing and start praying, when I stop pontificating and I realize that the truth I have is one that is seen and mirrored dimly. When I stop trying to pad my privilege and start finding ways to defend those living with almost no privilege. When I stop pointing out all the reasons why folks at Central fall short of perfection and start celebrating and inviting and living in a way that people want to come and see and follow Jesus with us into Central Sanctuary and far beyond its sanctuary, not as amazed observers who are impressed by Jesus, but on the ground disciples for social justice, evangels with an edge. It's a well-known fact that you need to eat well to be an evangelical social justice Christian. You need to feed your body with a diet that builds up the soul. And so to you, the company of evangelical social justice Christians, wherever you are worshiping and wherever you are serving, come to dinner regularly. Come, fill yourself at the table of God's grace, and then get out of your sanctuary to follow the loving Lord of grace wherever He may lead. Amen.